Welcome to Stigma Shakers podcast. I am your host, Ali Hensley, author, speaker, and stigma shaker of the best kind. This podcast is all about shaking and breaking up taboo into digestible chunks, which we like to call our social smoothie. In this podcast, I will ask the difficult questions that can be hard to digest because everyone deserves a little balance in their mental health diet. And let's face it, folks, the only thing normal in this world is different. So my question to you, can we make truth the next biggest trend? Today joining me is the fiercely impressive Saifa Wall. Saifa, who identifies as he, him, his, is a black queer intersex activist and rising scholar. Born and raised in the Bronx, Saifa attended Williams College and has since lived and worked in New York City, the San Francisco Bay Area, and Atlanta, Georgia. He is a Marie Skolowdska-Curie Fellow at the University of Huddersfield in England, examining the erasure of intersex people from social policy in Ireland and England. As an activist, Saifa is committed to racial equity and a radical vision of bodily autonomy for people with intersex variations. He made history by confronting the surgeon on ABC News Nightline who performed his gonadectomy at the age of 13. Above all else, Saifa is determined to end harmful and invasive genital surgery on intersex children and advocate for affirming healthcare for all people with intersex variations. Well, welcome to Saifa. It's so incredible to have you on the Stigma Shakers podcast. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Saifa and I we've probably had about 3 or 4 conversations maybe in the last couple of years because we work in the same sphere as advocates. And so we're learning a lot off each other, and hopefully this podcast will take the next step in destigmatizing something that is so incredibly important to destigmatize, and that's the beautiful, wonderful world of what you're doing for intersex activism and advocacy. Of course, congratulations on the film that is going to premiere tomorrow, which is Everybody? Beautiful name.
Yes, the film is Everybody by Julie Cohen, who directed RBG, and My Name is Pauli Murray, and a couple other films I can't think of off the top of my head.
Oh no, yeah, she's a name, and I've obviously just seen the trailers and the clips on socials, and it's so incredibly moving. And I'm not just saying that because I'm hugely biased, but it's so incredibly moving, beautifully curated, and I can't wait to see. Congratulations. Obviously, having conversations, around stigma can be a lot.
Right.
So to ease our guests and listeners into this pod chat, I'd just like to ask a few kind of loosening up questions, if you don't mind, before we dive in. But if you can we're going to dive in. But if you can just do not a quick summary, because I don't know if there is a quick answer, but your definition of the term intersex.
Right. For me, when I think of intersex, I think of sex characteristics that everyone has. I think there's an assumption that, intersex people have cornered the market on sex characteristics, and we all actually have sex characteristics. So when I talk about sex characteristics, I'm talking about hormones, chromosomes, reproductive organs, both internal and external, that are considered by the medical establishment to be atypical for males and females.
Why do you believe intersex? And this is such a very hard question probably to answer. Why is it so stigmatized? Why does it remain so hard to convey its truth to society, to medicine? I guess if you knew all those, why?
How many podcasts are you willing to commit to this question, Ali?
As many as it takes.
Oh man. Wow. Where do you start? I mean that I think this is like a huge
Mm,
question, right? Because I think so much of, who we are as people with intersex variations, so much of it is shrouded in secrecy and silence and stigma. Because I think our embodiment defies social expectations of what a woman or a man or a male or a female is supposed to be. It's I think I think we've all have internalized and believed this myth of gender, right?
mm,
And so I think for people whose bodies do not conform to these very rigid ideas of gender, it creates a position where people have to lie. They feel shame about who they are. Um, and that doesn't, help anyone.
right. No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I'm incredibly aware that as someone who advocates also for rare, unique, somewhat, I don't know how you feel about the word if you want to put it as taboo, but I think it would be safe to say that in some ways. I would never ask you to completely divulge your body to us, to me right now. However, if you can,
However,
for
please
those
do.
who, however, please tell us everything you know. No, but what in terms of its physical characteristics, I do believe that it's still massively unknown and massively confusing for a lot of people that may not. Is it ignorant? Is it that they don't want to know? Is it that they don't feel that they can ask? But physically, and I know there's 30 variations and there's a huge spectrum, but its main characteristics, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on the person because I
Yeah,
think
right.
even within sort of like intersex variations, there's just so much diversity within characteristics. So I think there's an assumption that people with intersex variations, there's a huge misconception that people have both, right? Both
Mm-hmm.
genitals, both reproductive organs. And I think that's what contributes to the stigma. Because I think also, there's an issue around privacy where people feel like, this is my personal medical business that I don't have to tell anyone, which is people are entitled to privacy,
Yeah.
right? But yeah, I think because of the sort of like misconception, I think it sort of really erases and belies um, how unique and how different sort of like intersex bodies are, right? So there might be people who have sort of cystic ovaries, right? There may be
Mm-hmm.
people who have periods, who, you know, have what's considered typical female development and may grow beards. There may be, people with penises where the urethra is located closer toward the scrotum, right? So I think it's just really, there's just so much variation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're just so used to sort of typecasting sort of like men and women in certain ways. But, both you and I know, like, if you've been sexual with more than one person in your lifetime, you would know that there's just so much variation in bodies.
Yeah, right. It is that, and I love the way that you used, and not the word typical, because I absolutely have a huge dislike to the word normal. Like it's almost become something that I'm becoming an advocate just for that simple word. So in terms of, okay, so the difference immediately between Saifa and myself, is that I'm XX chromosome, right? And you're XY chromosome. And so we both have experienced in the development, in gestation, a gene mutation. I don't know. For those who don't necessarily know what AIS is, it's actually quite a common intersex medical terminology, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's something about, I think I'm curious about your use of the word mutation, right? Because, yeah, I think it's, for me, I kind of like, the mutation kind of makes the assumption that there's a default normal. And so if it's not normal, then that's a mutation, right? But, the way I like to think about it is it's like everyone starts off intersex.
Right.
Everyone, right?
I shared that in podcast the other day. Actually, I should probably repeat it right now because everyone before, even when they're the embryo and you're assigned your sex and blah blah blah, we're still at that point.
Right.
No difference.
Totally. Yeah. And then sex differentiation happens, and again, sex differentiation happens along a spectrum, right? And so with my particular trait, it affects children who are, XY fetuses. And essentially it really depends on a person's sort of response to testosterone. So you have complete AIS where the children, when they're born, they look phenotypically female. And I put that in quotes. And then it's a range all the way to mild androgen insensitivity syndrome where the children look phenotypically male, but may have issues with fertility. And then because it's a spectrum, then you have sort of gradients in the middle, and my body falls somewhere along the middle. So for me, because of having sort of atypical genitals, at birth, people couldn't necessarily, the attending doctors, couldn't really determine, my sex initially, and then they marked female.
Right. And there the issue begins, right? So that's what, and I know that, yourself and your fellow activists really advocate for the unnecessary surgeries. Do I feel like I'm really being PC? I'm trying to walk, I'll just say it to our listeners, I'm trying to walk a really good line here because my impartial,
totally.
It's sensitive, and especially within the community of MRKH, we'll get to that. But I like the way that, and you really do pick me up. Like, you're right. The word mutation would suggest that something is wrong, but it does go potentially, is it going against what we know as science to be typical, or is it nature's way and therefore difference is normal?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that we have to really examine science, right? Because I think we often accept science as something that's just objective, purely facts, purely analytical, and it's not, right? Because at one time there was science to say that women who had enlarged clitorises had to be subject to clitorectomies, to curb masturbation, to curb lesbianism, and to address hysteria. That was part of medicine. That was part of science. To suggest that is nowadays is just absurd. But that was actually a part of science. So I think we really need to question what is science, and but more importantly, what is the foundation of science?
You're assigned female at birth.
Correct.
Then at 13, you had a surgery. Can you tell us a bit about that? Because something really amazing happened for you with that past trauma.
Oh, yeah.
It was in your bio. It's amazing.
Oh, yeah. I was very fortunate to be able to do that, but which we'll probably talk about later. But, I mean, so I was fortunate in that, the protocol at the time for children with AIS who were assigned female was that essentially the testes were referred to as gonads. The gonads would be removed at birth, and then the child would be raised as female and then eventually put on feminizing hormones like estrogen and progesterone. So my mom decided against early intervention. So I grew up with my testicles. Like I literally have somatic memories of being able to feel my testicles because they were undescended, right? So they kind of rested in my lower abdomen. And I think having that memory is like really intense, because it's not something that happened before I could feel or know what it was to have, them in my body, but I knew what it was to have them in my body. So because, testicles are meant to live in a scrotum, I definitely experienced some pain. Because they were undescended, I most likely had hernias, I believe. And when my mom took me to the pediatrician when I was probably around 12 and a half, this was back at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York City. The endocrinologist at the time made the recommendation that my testes be removed. So essentially I was castrated, and shortly after I was put on feminizing hormones, which, like I have said many times, have feminized my face and body, effects that I still live with today.
How do you feel about that?
It makes me feel rage. It makes me feel rage. It makes me feel grief and sadness, for the young person who did not know what was happening, was not offered thorough informed consent, for the lies that were told to my mother and to me. So yeah, I feel rage and I feel grief, and I believe both of those feelings can coexist at the same time.
I've actually got a little lump in my throat, to be honest with you. That sounds barbaric, and really, it does sound barbaric. And do you want to hear? Like, I'm so sorry. A friend of mine, like, do you want? I mean, I want to sort of say, I want to say that, like, but some people, like, I don't want to.
Well, I think if it was anyone else, I would be like, meh. But because it's from you as someone who also has an intersex variation, like, it hits a little different. You know what I'm saying?
Do you find it when people say that to you, if it wasn't, say, me, if people are trying to maybe find a link of connection stroke, do you want people to feel the sympathy, or do you find that even more hard to kind of process? Like, you don't know what your sympathy is about. You can't empathize with this.
No, I mean, I think, people have different experiences, right? Like, I think people who have been subject to sexual assault, people who have experienced medical violence themselves, I think this is an issue of violence. This is an issue of, trespass. So I do feel like, although people may not have the same experience, I do feel that people can relate to violation.
There is a massive amount of overlap that I've decided to exist, and it's only in the last few years where I have become more comfortable in who I am to be able to kind of like any kind of judgments, assumptions, stereotypes, because I've become more okay with that now. Right. And I'm older and I'm not so affected necessarily by fitting in a box and
right,
or a drop down menu that doesn't exist. But in terms of, I guess, after that surgery, how did you get from that surgery? And there's a lot of time and facts and experiences here. Sorry, loaded question. To where you are today. Was there a turning point? Was there like, fuck this? Like, this is not, I can't do this.
Yeah, I feel like what was sort of life-saving to me was, in 2000, so in 2015, 24, I started my sort of medical transition. So I started taking testosterone, and it wasn't doing the same thing for me as it does for, other people who are female to male trans. But I think what was sort of life affirming was sort of meeting this person, Jim, who had a similar story to me, except that he was like a white guy from Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Oh,
you
Jim.
know?
Yeah.
But, he had been assigned female at birth, and, he was mutilated as a young person. And, I say all this because his story is public as well.
Mm-hmm.
And, we both had surgery, top surgery, which is sort of the removal of our breasts, with the same surgeon. And I think we started testosterone within like 6 months of each other. And, I think it did different things for him than it did for me, right? But sort of meeting him was really life affirming. And, I haven't talked about it a lot. But I think for me, because of being misgendered a lot,
Right.
I think it really just devastated me. And, I don't think I had suicidal ideation, but I definitely was like, well, what if I just am not here anymore, And I think for me, I think the turning point was, I was like, well, if I killed myself, no one would know my story. No one would know what had happened to me. No one would know anything. And then I was like, I need to push back. I need to fight back. And I also need to ensure that this doesn't happen to anyone. That I will use my voice and my experience to make sure that no child has to experience the violation that I have.
That is an incredible use of pain and rage and anger. And whilst I'm not quite sure, as you say, sometimes if that ever goes, it can lessen for sure. And grief,
Right.
The whole grief that surrounds, I was going to say development of sexual disorders then, and that's a term we'll come on to in a second, but I don't use that term. I do not affirm, because you say disorder, you say it's wrong. Right. But yeah, and I think as you say, and I'm trying so hard, not so hard. This is natural to me.
But
I just don't want to put my
keep
foot in it.
Real, Allie.
I know. I think I just want to be sensitive and really truly honor, everybody, because there are so many different experiences. Right. And I think when you're given an opportunity to have a platform, use it wisely. Right. Be careful with that. And so, yeah, talking about the grief and how you have, I don't know if this could potentially sound a bit sanctimonious, but I'm not sure sometimes if advocacy activism finds us, because it's really odd, right? I was in search for a support group because I'd spent 20 years, and I've thought a lot about this recently as well, in a body that didn't fit the word that I was supposed to live by. And I don't know whether it's sort of like almost, this is probably the first time I've said it out loud actually, but there felt like a bit of a gender dysmorphia in me, because I had to, for those of you who have not listened about this before, a condition called MRKH, which stands for Mayer-Rokitansky-Kauster-Hauser syndrome, affects 1 in 5,000 females. Can you so I'm just reeling it off the tongue, and it's
that's a mouthful.
It's the most unglamorous, but then isn't anything like, not unglamorous, but it's like MRKH, and it's like, that's not very interesting. But it's characterized by the underdevelopment of the uterus, cervix, and vaginal canal. So people with MRKH2 are on a spectrum of, some have uterus remnants, some have, like, we have ovaries, some have no vagina, which is like a dimple, and some have some, and then externally typical of a female. And for me, I had to make my own vaginal canal at the age of 16, and I did consent, and I wasn't forced into that. Ooh. But I think when you're a child, being awake, I guess, and forcing objects into your body to stretch a vagina, and it's not like a cocoon down there, it's mass, it's muscle mass. And you know, I always say, when your knuckles turn white, was what the nurse said to me, you're doing it correctly. And so for me, I always linked this is my thing, I linked progress with pain, love, intimacy with pain. And I look like you're going to ask a question.
I do. I need to ask you a question.
Go for it.
Well, I mean, I know you told your story many times and you're used to telling your story, but it's just like what you described to me sounds atrocious, right? Especially for a young woman to be subjected to, even if you were doing it to yourself. And so, I'm wondering, it's just like, have you ever felt the weight of your words?
Well, for 20 years, I was in denial, and the weight of my words, it represented itself in huge destructive behavior. That was the weight and the pain of the situation. It's almost like trying to find a crevice to kind of the pain to come out. And because I didn't have the skills or emotional intelligence or the being able to articulate, I do feel that I was in control of that decision. And I feel that, no, it's a hard one, because I truly was very cared for. I don't have any malice towards the team. My only thing that I continue to say is that psychological assessment, I believe, must be a part of that process when delivering options for vaginal lengthening, whether it be surgical or non-surgical. If I wanted to have a vagina, if I wanted to have it, they were my two options. Or no options at all. You don't have to have a vagina. You don't have to be fixed, right? We don't like that word, fixed. So for me, I feel like it's not my podcast, but for me, I knew that I got like, because I got these big firing ovaries, I got these big boobs, and I got this waist, and my boobs annoy me, because I'm just like, you're surplus to my requirement, and they get in my way, and they remind me of this picture of womanhood. And sometimes I love that, and sometimes I'm like, you're just reminding me of what my body doesn't do right, in air quotes. But only recently, have I started to understand that my version of womanhood has to be completely rewritten. Because I didn't know what it meant to be a woman. I knew that you look away. I think I even once I knew I could never get pregnant, but I do remember doing a pregnancy test, and I'm like, this is crazy. But maybe they've got it wrong, or maybe I just need to know what it feels like to pee on a stick. It's really, it's a hard.
But also it just makes me think of like, even though you were in control of that decision, like even though you're like, this is a decision I made for myself, it just really makes me think about how compulsive heterosexuality is, how compulsive gender normativity is, right? Because it's almost like for you to feel like a woman, for you to be accepted as a woman, you have to have a vagina, right? And it has, especially if you are interested in dating men, if you're interested in having sex with people with penises, then it's just like, you have to have a vagina, right? And so I think it's just like,
yeah, right.
I think it's just all these pressures.
Well, this is the association, and I hope that it's changing present day. But you know, a vagina isn't to facilitate a penis. Some is to have
Those are
penetrative sex,
facts.
and those are facts. People put that on a t-shirt.
Yeah, those are facts.
But some people want empowerment. Some people want to reclaim something. Sometimes people are doing it because they feel that that's what they should be doing. Children, I don't know. I just want I would just like to see more of that. I mean, I think in Singapore, they actually do ask the people with MRKH to go through a 12-month psychological assessment before they even put close to a dilator, because not everybody's going to have a traumatic experience, you know, public service announcement. Not everybody does. But,
Right.
yeah, I just think understanding the whys behind a person having a vagina, and if they're completely 100% ready, that's something that I'd love to see across the globe. We do it okay in the UK, we do in America and Australia and the countries that I mainly have advocated in, which makes me sound a little bit too westernized in that way, but we do have global MRKH, which looks at the globe. Anyway, so that's my story. So it's just a little interesting about how being in a body that doesn't fit. And so how did you you obviously you took that pain, you took that anger, you took that rage, you met beautiful Jim, and now you're this incredible global activist, right? And you did something very profound on a news station. Please expand.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think for me, someone asked me recently in the interview, like, how do I experience joy? And, you know, I don't really use that term joy a lot. But what I can say is that I have gratitude for being able to live long enough for things to come around.
Right.
And I think one of the things that came around was sort of being presented with the opportunity to confront the surgeon who castrated me. This happened in 2014. It was ABC News Nightline, a station in the US. And basically they had approached the organization where I was board president at the time, and they were looking to do the story of someone who confronted their surgeon. And I confronted Dr. Hensel, and people can look it up. It's a really powerful segment. But he was awful. And I think the producers were very sympathetic because I think he was very narcissistic, very unaccountable. But I think in doing that, there was something that really shifted inside of me and something that I was able to let go. And I think this wasn't captured on video, but basically I said to him, I was just like, for what it's worth, I was a 14-year-old girl. And you told me in front of my mother that you would shave down my clitoris and create a cavity inside of me. And literally when he said that to me, it made me sick to my stomach. And my mom looked over at me and she was like, do you want to go through with this? Because she must have saw my discomfort. And I said, no. And that was the only thing that spared me from genital surgery. And mind you, this consultation happened not too long after I was castrated. And so I told him that, you know, I was seated right across from him and I told him that. And he couldn't say anything. He couldn't say a word, you know? And I think in that moment, like I sort of like took care of that 14-year-old girl who was like emotionally young, who was this gender non-conforming gay child, this young black girl. I took care of her. And I also sat across from him as a 30-something-year-old man and told him about what he did to that girl.
I'm sure you've heard the words brave a lot, but that's like the thing is, he couldn't argue with the truth. You weren't saying anything that was not factual. Your surgeon obviously had no context or concept, I should say, as you as a necessary like a person, and devaluing what you truly knew to be right. And thank God for your mama, because I feel like she was an absolute advocate with you, and his lack of voice in that interview, or that one-sided fair argument, gave you your voice.
Right.
And kind of, did it feel like some sort of justice or not?
No, it did feel like justice, because I think for me, it wasn't even about his response, because his response was terrible, right? But his response, now mind you, I wanted to hit him in the throat. I wanted to knock him in the throat.
Yeah.
But the thing is like, whether he acknowledged the pain that he caused or whether he didn't, I vindicated myself.
From a societal perspective, because we're talking about stigmas and we're talking about society, like a societal kind of shift, this podcast hopefully could achieve great things, but you've got to start somewhere.
Totally.
And I'd love to know what is one of the biggest misconceptions, or one of the most ludicrous things or comment or belief system that you have had to answer or be subject to, or the intersex community have been subject to, that they've had to kind of defend?
I mean, I think it's one that we don't exist. There's a conservative belief that intersex doesn't exist. Intersex variations don't exist. It's just men and women with disorders, which for me is. And I feel like, we have been talked about, but not engaged with. I feel like often the way intersex has been depicted in media is really sensationalized, really hyped to sort of really kind of prop up the myth that an intersex person has both organs. So I think hopefully we're entering increasingly a realm where, we as intersex people can tell our own stories, and not have them defined by people who don't have these variations or live with these experiences.
I think it's really interesting, right? Language. And that's been something that we in the community have tried really hard to rectify, working with hospitals, working with institutions, working with online medical resources, because words carry weight. And if you talk to someone, and you'd know this, in diagnosis, people don't necessarily always remember like the medical terminology and the diagrams and the ultrasounds and the thing and the bloods and all the kind of thing. People remember that exact word that was imparted on them. That's what they'll remember.
Right.
We're not fond of the word ambiguous. We're not fond of the word fix. There is others. Like, what other ones do you personally
abnormal?
Abnormal's in there.
Oh God.
Disorder, like defect.
It's terrible.
Malfunction. But I do really want to ask you a question that it's in the LGBTI sphere, but I know it's something that society's talking a lot about, which is pronouns. We've just leaping around, but that's okay. That's okay. So
that's fine.
I was doing, because I think your interaction with the community hopefully is kind of an authority on this topic a little bit. And I just know that the expansion of pronouns is huge. I was reading some research the other day that there's between, and please correct me if I'm wrong, between like 30 to 75 different pronouns that some universities now they have documented. Like, I think they were told off for it, but they were documented for it. And it's quite divisive. You know, people get their, people do get their backups. Why do we have to introduce another one? Why are we complicating things so much? And then you've got the other argument, which is true. Like, I can identify with how I want to identify, Right. And so why do you think it's so hard for people to necessarily get their heads around pronouns?
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me lately of when Elon Musk declared on Twitter that cis is a slur, right? And then you have trans folks, you have other people being like, well, cis means same, trans means on the other side of, right? So I think race and gender, at least two categories that I focus on, we all have really deeply held beliefs around those two categories. And I think it's backed up by years and centuries of beliefs, right? To the point where we don't even know where those beliefs started. So I think with gender, it's almost like it reminds me of something my therapist said, right? Because, she was talking about relationships and she was just like, everything in romantic relationships can be fine, but when people feel triggered, then they default to their survival strategies, right? We're in a moment where we all have literally lived through this huge trauma called COVID and the pandemic. That's still ongoing, but this has been a huge trauma, and I think people's different trauma responses are really evident, right? Some people are like, COVID never happened. They were like, I'm not masking. COVID isn't real. Some people are just like, I am terrified. I will mask for the rest of my life. Other people are just like, I'm so glad this is over, right? I feel like with gender, people are like, this is who I am. Don't tell me I'm not who I am. Don't tell me that I'm not a man. Don't tell me that I'm not a woman. Don't tell me that I'm a birthing person. Don't tell me I'm a chest feeder. Like, I am a man. I am a woman. That's the way it always has been. It's in the Bible. There's so much proof, right? And, I think we're being presented with new ways of sort of thinking about how we have constructed our society, like the bedrock, the foundation of our society, and it triggers people's trauma responses, right? So people are just like, that's not real. Trans people, that's a phase. Or people are like, I hate trans people.
Yeah. It's a trend.
Totally.
It's a trend. It's fashion. No, it's not. No. But I think that, as you say, and I think people don't like change, and I think society needs simplicity, and I think society needs neatness,
right?
And anything that people don't understand, and I think, anything that people don't understand, like we take it into a cancel culture. Is cancel culture toxic to developing understanding? So, Instagram pages being shut down, people not being able to talk about sex, like slamming advocacy movements. Or do you think cancel culture is actually, okay, like we're just going to probably, we're just going to measure how much change we can do slowly. Should we be shutting people down? Or should we be drip feeding?
I don't know. I mean, I don't subscribe to cancel culture. Like, I think for me, I think it reminds me of bullying. I think it's not productive. I think it's actually pretty destructive. And I feel like, I think there is, I think this is a hard one, right? Because I think there are just like these larger kind of like sort of like political forces. You know, if we put this in a context of like a very well-funded anti-gender movement that's seeking to silence and erase trans people, that are interested in taking away the rights of women, that are pushing back and trying to disenfranchise like LGB people, even though you have, you know, LGB conservatives who are trans exclusive. You know, I just think like people really don't listen to each other. And I think because social media really encourages sort of like this platforming, people really don't listen to each other. I think people talk past each other, which I think also contributes to cancel culture. Because for me, it's, you know, I don't live my life on social media, right? Like, if, you know, I know you, Allie, right? So if we, you know, we don't know each other that well, but the thing is like, if I have an issue with you, I'm not going to talk about you on social media. That's dumb.
I know, we're going to go on a podcast and talk about it. Okay, like I am so conscious of the time. Like, I don't know whether you can run over by 5 minutes.
Yeah. I got 5 minutes for you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So really, there's one really juicy question.
Yes, juicy, yes.
But thinking about, okay, so I think we're going to invite Saifa back because there is so much to this, and I think it's fascinating, and it's actually brings me on to my next point. So Saifa and I were exchanging voice notes the other day, and we had like a chuckle to ourselves. As an advocate within the MRKH community, I was asking the question. You've got to look. It's kind of cool. It's kind of cool. It's kind of scary. Whose role is it to know stuff? So for me, I always think if I get a comment or a question that I find a little bit, maybe, I don't know if I think it's insensitive. I don't know whether it's people just genuinely want to know, or whether people are just trying to make it easier on them, easier on me. But I always think any question for me is an opportunity to like educate. I'm not saying that you're not educated, but I also think it's quite interesting how you say we kind of have to do it differently. Like maybe education isn't from the advocate out, or is it from society in? Or have I completely have I misread our voice notes? Because they were funny. I didn't, I was like, let's save this for the podcast. Yeah.
Well, I think it's just like, you know, I really wanted to come on this podcast because, you know, I feel like there needs to be more overlap and more dialogue and more conversation between the advocate community and the activist community. And I think at times there has been outright hostility or indifference, you know.
I'm nodding, by the way.
Yeah, you know.
There's been a lot of adversity about the word intersex within the MRKH community, yeah.
Totally, right? And so the thing is, like, for me, I think since I've been in England, I'm not concerned whether people use intersex or not to describe themselves. That's not important to me. I think what's more important to me is, like, what are we doing to sort of challenge medicalization or force medicalization? That, for me, is a bigger issue. And so, you know, I feel like just from the limited dialogues that I've had with people in the advocate community, I think we're definitely, I feel like a lot of our curriculums overlap. There may be places where they diverge, but there's a lot of overlap. And I'm really curious about the ways that we can sort of be in dialogue, that we can collaborate, you know, that we can share resources, because I think often, you know, and I don't think it's a coincidence that that our issues have been pitted against each other, right? And for me, I just feels like, you know, I feel like that's just not helpful, you know?
I really do. And I've been as in advocacy for 12 years. And I've heard various comments, I'm not this, oh, but I identified it. Well, you can't identify as that. You got XX, the doctor said, medical said, chromosome said. So I think in a world of confusion and also, dare I say, association with not understanding terminology and understanding intersex and developmental everything, I think you're right. We need to speak amongst each other. To really, I think, I'm not even trying to simplify it, but somewhere along the line, some shit's gone down. And
Yeah.
I think, and you're nodding, and I think so too, because I think we can't say let's pride ourselves on uniqueness when we're unwilling, though. I'll be unique as long as I won't necessarily be that unique that's sort of kind of just over there in that corner. We need to have the conversations together to really strengthen the stigma.
Totally.
Shaking. I know.
Look at you! Look at you! Look at you! Coming back
little
to
bit of branding.
I'm
circling. I'm doing a full circle. Yeah, circling back. Saifa, I mean, there is so much that we could have spoken about, but I mean, everything you were saying is gold, and your experience, your articulation, the hard stuff, the shit shows, the repurposing the pain, discovering your voice, for standing up and saying difference is normal, because that's my thing. Like, difference is normal. The only thing that normal in this world is difference. Like, once we wrap our heads around that, society, we could potentially be less unhappy and coexist a bit more calmer. Now, this podcast is all about shaking up and breaking up stigmas into digestible chunks for others to understand and absorb. So we like to call it our social smoothie. With that metaphor in mind, Saifa, what would be your social smoothie ingredient?
So, at first I thought it was actually like actual ingredients for a smoothie, and I got really excited. I was like, yes! But, man, I feel like, with any smoothie, you need like a base. So you need like a liquid, and you need some good fruits, like some bananas, some kale, some apple. Then you need some this, some that. So I feel like, like a social smoothie is like, I think for me, what's important is like accountability, transparency, listening, grace, integrity, and I think the ability to repair, because I think conflict is inevitable, but what does repair look like? And I think my strongest relationships are built on repair.
That's one tasty smoothie. That's one good, nourishing for the mental health smoothie. Does it have a name?
Ooh. Let me see. I guess, I don't know. Let's call it the Saifa smoothie.
Let's just stay on point. We don't need more complexity in our lives. Let's just keep it simple. I'll definitely suck on a Saifa smoothie. Something I didn't think I'd say today. Yeah. On that note, well, how can people find you, Saifa? How can people follow your wonderful work?
Yeah, I know the young people be on TikTok, and I do have an account there, but I don't really post there that often. So don't try to find me there. But it's Saifa Emerges on TikTok and Instagram. People can also hit me up on SeanSaifa.com. And yeah, those are the places where I am mostly. And you might catch me doing interviews and whatever in these internet streets,
Oh, yeah, you're incredibly so proactive. So, I don't know how you do it all and be a scholar. But I'll put the wonderful Saifa's contact details in our show notes. And Saifa, again, congratulations on the film that's being released tomorrow, and for being so brave and open and honest with your story. And I'm just so pleased that you exist in this world. You make it a better place.
That's so sweet. Thank you so
Yeah.
much, Allie, and thank you so much for having the show and a wonderful conversation. And like I totally agree with you. We can chat for hours, meow meow meow. But yeah, it's just it's an ongoing conversation. So yeah.